Hi, this is Sam Mustafa, and I'm back to talk about the latest game from Honor, Eisenhower. This is the second video in which I go through the system to resolve combats. If you haven't watched the first Eisenhower video yet, I strongly recommend that you do so. It explains the game's basic sequence and core mechanics. Before we get started, I once again want to emphasize that these videos are not meant as a substitute for the game rules. I will not be making a complete video of the entire game. My purpose here is to highlight some of the most important basic game concepts and systems to help new players get started faster and with less time spent consulting the book. But you still need the rules. Speaking of things you'll need, before we get started, you should go to the Honor website, sammustafa.com, and to the Downloads page, and under Eisenhower, download the file called SHAFE and have it printed out or on your screen while you watch this video. This package gives you all the accessories for the full basic and advanced rules. It has the quick reference sheets, a blank copy of the command post, a sample introductory scenario, a sheet with game markers if you'd like to use them, and the advanced game's scenario maps for creating fictional battles. We're going to be using a file from SHAFE. It's the introductory scenario Counterattack on the Mias. And this video is going to review the procedure for resolving combat in the basic game. We'll be using some examples from that scenario. Again, it is not intended to be a complete review of all the movement rules nor all the additional options available in the advanced game. This video is just to help new players who already have the rules in hand get through their first few rounds playing the game and go through the process of resolving a combat. The first thing to know is that the game has a stacking limit of no more than 3 units per square. Let's imagine it's the start of a German round, and all the black units you see here belong to a single formation, the 23rd Panzer Division. In the lower left corner you can see a scary battle group consisting of a Tiger Battalion, probably attached to the division by the army commander, a normal Panzer Battalion, and the half-track symbol represents a battalion of mechanized infantry. The other 3 German units are infantry symbols with wheels at their feet, meaning lorried infantry, i.e. carried in trucks. On the Soviet side, the units in red, we see in the upper left corner 2 infantry battalions and a tank battalion, and then in the town, 2 infantry battalions, one of which is tilted there and has the word "warn" beside it. Units have 3 steps in the game. When the game starts, they're fresh, and that's what all units are in this example, except for that one Soviet infantry unit that's worn. If that one takes another step loss, it will become exhausted, and if it takes another after that, it's eliminated, i.e. removed from the board. The other thing to notice is that the worn unit has a prepared marker, meaning that it is dug in and will have an advantage on defense. As long as half or more of the units in a square are prepared, they all count as being prepared, and so our Soviet defenders in the town are in a good position to defend themselves, even if they are outnumbered and a bit beat up. So, it's the German players' round. They've activated the 23rd Panzer Division by placing that op where you see it there, creating an area of operations so that all the adjacent squares are active, and thus all of these German units, that's pretty much the entire 23rd Panzer Division, can move out and attack. The Germans are making 2 attacks. Tracked units, that's the tanks and half-tracks, can move 2 squares and attack in either the first or second square of their moves. Here you see them covering the ground and barreling straight into those Soviet defenders in the upper left square. Lorried infantry can also move 2 squares, but they can only attack in the first square of their move. That's because they have to dismount in order to attack. But they started adjacent to the town, so they each move 1 as shown on foot. Note that the attackers came from 2 different squares, but they end up in the town fighting together. Note also that if those German lorried infantry have to retreat, then they're going to have to retreat the way they came, meaning back into 2 different squares. Combat happens in a defender's square. That square is called contested until its combat is resolved. The combat is a contest for control of the square. Now, having completed all their moves, the German player chooses one of these combats, resolves it, including any retreats, and then moves on to the next combat, resolves that until all combats are resolved. There's some cases, especially in the advanced game, in which defenders can withdraw before a combat happens, but generally speaking, if you attack the enemy square, there will be a combat. Before we get into the mechanics of combat, let's look at the German and Soviet command posts, because this is where you'll find each side's artillery dice. Each side gets a number of artillery dice for each formation, typically 1 or 2. That represents the divisional artillery. And each side usually also has at least 1 reserve artillery dice placed in this display on the command post. That represents the big guns held at corps or army level. These dice behave sort of like ops. You start them each day in the available panel of their display, and as you use them, they're moved to the used panel to indicate that you can't use them again today. In the next day's command phase, you'll reset them to available again. It's a good idea to use a different color of dice for your artillery so that you can roll them along with the other combat dice, but then remember to put them back in the used boxes after the combat. There are some additional rules about eligibility for using artillery dice, particularly for units that are isolated or out of supply, or in the advanced game for things like amphibious and airborne landings, but for this introductory video we'll keep things simple. Here we see that the 23rd Panzer Division has 2 available artillery dice, that's their divisional batteries, and the German command has another 3 in reserve, although 1 of those is already used, so really only 2 remaining reserve artillery dice. The Soviets have already used all their formation dice today and have only 1 available die in reserve artillery. By the way, if this were a real game, you'd see the ops on these command posts too in the available and used sections of their panels, as I explained in the first video. In the interest of clarity for this example, I took them off so we could concentrate just on using the artillery. And in case you're wondering why the Russians don't have mythological quantities of artillery, Soviet formation artillery was actually quite meager. They preferred to mass the guns in huge artillery formations for barrages in support of major offensives. Most divisional support was done by mortars. And yes, the game covers that, but that's not our scenario here, in which some exhausted Soviet units have been caught by a German counterattack. So our German player, being the active player, the attacker, gets to choose the sequence of resolving combats, and they've chosen the one on the upper left with all the tanks. In this combat, the Germans have 1 mechanized infantry, 1 armor, and 1 superior armor, that's the Tiger unit, against the Soviets who have 1 armor and 2 infantry. In game terms, that square is flat, meaning the battle will take place in open terrain. There's something else important about this combat, the relative unit quality. The German units are veterans, meaning that when they're fresh like this, they have a firepower value of 3 or better. The Soviets, although they are also fresh, are only trained quality, meaning their firepower value is 4 or better. Now would be a good time to look at page 2 of the quick reference sheet, specifically the illustration of the combat cycle. The first step of the cycle is for both sides to commit their artillery dice to the combat if they desire and have it available. The attackers, in this case the Germans, have to do so first. The German player allocates the 2 artillery dice from their formation artillery, i.e. the divisional batteries of the 23rd Panzer Division. The Soviets have only that 1 artillery die in their reserve box, which they allocate to the combat. These dice are taken off the command post and put beside the combat. It's a good idea to use a different color of dice for your artillery than you use for the units, because after rolling, you'll return those dice to the command post as used, and once they're used for the day. They don't get reset until the following command phase of the next day. Now let's have a look at how many dice the units roll. We go to the next step in the cycle. In open terrain like this, infantry units, no matter what their mode of transport may be, roll 1 die each in combat. Armor units roll 2 dice each. But that Tiger battalion is what the game calls a superior armor unit, and so it gets a bonus die when fighting in the open. So let's start by tallying up the Germans' dice. They get those 2 artillery dice you see in white, then the unit dice in red. They get 3 for the Tiger, 2 for the Panzer IV, 1 for the mechanized infantry, for a total of 6 dice for their units plus 2 artillery dice equals 8. The Soviets get 2 dice for their tank battalion and 1 each for their infantry. That's 4 red dice for their units, and they've got 1 white artillery die for a total of 5. What are the success numbers we need? In other words, what does each dice need to roll in order for it to score a hit in combat? On the smaller of those two yellow circles there in the combat cycle, you see that all artillery dice, that's for everybody under all conditions, rolls a 4 or better to hit. But the units do so based on firepower value, and you can see in that table there in the upper left that it depends on whether they're trained or veteran and what condition they're in, fresh, worn, or exhausted. For fresh veteran units, that would be all of our German units, they score hits on rolls of 3 or better. So the Germans are going to need to roll their 2 artillery dice separately because they hit on 4s and better, and then their unit dice, which hit on 3s and better, and then they'll tally up all the hits they score. Soviets in this combat are all fresh trained units which hit on 4 and better. That's the same as artillery, so they can just roll all their dice at the same time because they all need to hit on 4s and better. So each side now rolls, counts the number of hits they scored, and this is going to be resolved simultaneously because neither side is prepared. And here are the results. The Germans scored a total of 5 hits. The Soviets scored a total of 3. Now we have to convert those hits to losses on the opposing units. Hits become losses according to that formula you see there on the combat cycle. The first hit you score converts to 1 unit loss. Thereafter, each 2 additional hits score another loss. So the Germans, by scoring 5 hits, have inflicted 3 losses on the Soviets. The first one scored a hit, that's 1 loss, then 2, then 2. The Soviets, by scoring 3 hits, therefore inflicted 2 losses. The first hit becomes a loss, and the next 2 become a loss. The person who suffered the losses gets to choose which units take them, but you can't inflict a second loss on a unit until you've inflicted 1 on each of your units in the combat. So the Soviet player doesn't really have a choice. They've got 3 units. They've taken 3 losses. Each Soviet unit is going to have to take 1. Each loss reduces a unit by 1 step. In fact, in the game, they're called step losses. You can see here are 3 Soviet units which started this battle fresh. They've taken a loss on each unit, and so all 3 of those Soviet units are now worn. Worn units have their firepower value reduced. A unit that's worn that takes another step loss becomes exhausted. That reduces its firepower even more. And an exhausted unit that takes another loss is eliminated. On the German side, they have to take 2 losses. Not surprisingly, our German player preserves his precious Tiger unit and assigns 1 loss each to the other 2 units. The Tiger stays fresh. Those other 2 German units are now worn. So who won this battle? The Soviet player has the option to retreat, but is not required to. Only exhausted units are forced to retreat from combats, and only when they get outscored. So the Soviets certainly can stay here, and they defiantly hold their ground. That means the Germans must retreat. Attacking units must retreat into the square from which they attack. Now, you might recall these Germans moved 2 squares to get into this fight. But you retreat into the square immediately before you enter that combat, and so they're going to retreat 1. Sometimes during movement, you've moved other units up into that square, meaning you can't retreat those without becoming overstacked, and in such a case, you have to keep retreating the shortest possible number of squares until you find a legal place to end. Our Germans here don't have that problem. This combat is over. Let's resolve the other one. This combat involves a town, and here we see 3 fresh battalions of veteran German infantry, having dismounted from their lorries, attacking the town, which in game terms is called urban terrain. That is close terrain for combat. It's also hard terrain, meaning the defenders have hard cover. One of those Soviet defenders is prepared. As long as at least half of the defenders are prepared, then all of those defenders, including their artillery dice, will shoot first. Whatever damage they do to the attackers is inflicted before the attackers can shoot back. So the Germans know this is going to be a tough fight. Artillery dice come first. The German player has used all the 23rd Panzer's artillery, but he commits both of his remaining reserve artillery dice to this battle. Reserve artillery can support units of any formation. The Soviets are all out of artillery dice and can't commit any. Infantry units fighting in close terrain like this roll 2 dice each. The Soviets, being prepared, will shoot first. Their fresh unit rolls 2 dice, and you can see a fresh trained unit needs to 4s or better to hit. Their worn unit will also roll 2, and you can see that they will need 5s or better to hit. The Soviets scored only 2 hits. That first one inflicts a loss on 1 German battalion. It doesn't matter which, they're all identical. That second hit by itself, though, isn't enough to score another loss, because for each subsequent loss you need 2 more. And so only 1 German infantry unit is going to be worn before the Germans get to shoot back. And here they go. The German dice are a little bit complicated, so let's look at them in the sequence you see on the left. They have 2 artillery dice. Artillery always hit on a 4 or better. That 1 worn battalion, it's a veteran unit. When worn, it hits on 4 or better. You can see fighting in close terrain, infantry rolls 2 dice. And then the 2 fresh battalions need 3s and better to hit. Those are those 4 dice you see there. So the Germans roll all those dice separately, and then they total the number of hits, and they've scored 6. Great score. But wait, the Soviets are prepared and defending hard terrain. All hits against prepared defenders in hard terrain need to be re-rolled. In Eisenhower, whenever you need to re-roll for any reason, under all circumstances, re-rolls succeed on a score of 3 or better. So the Germans have to re-roll their 6 hits, and their luck holds. 5 of them re-roll once again as hits. That's a total of 3 losses to the Soviets. Now remember, 1 Soviet unit was already worn. You have to inflict 1 on each before you can inflict that last loss on somebody else. So the Soviets have a couple options here, but what they decide to do is the fresh unit becomes worn, the worn unit becomes exhausted, and they've still got 1 more to inflict, and they make that other worn unit exhausted too. The Soviet player did it this way because they know they're going to have to retreat. Exhausted units have to retreat when they've been outscored, and so the Soviet player, instead of eliminating that 1 unit and saving another, decided might as well retreat from this town and hope to rally in the night using stockpiles. By retreating, they're going to lose that prepared marker and concede the town to the Germans, but at least they might live to fight another day. So the Soviet player has to retreat. That means the Germans are in possession of the town. They've taken the town. All attacking units must remain there. They've won the battle. The combat is over. There are, of course, more considerations for combat, even in the basic game. There are certain kinds of traits that some units have. There's certain kinds of terrain that adds complications. Artillery isn't always available. In the advanced game, there are additional dimensions, for example, the use of cards with general skills or other resources. But the 2 examples we just demonstrated cover the majority of combat situations and should give you a good idea of how combat is resolved in Eisenhower. If you have more questions about the game, feel free to join our Facebook forum, Sam Mustafa Publishing. You can also get there from the forum link on our website. Hope you enjoy the game. Look forward to hearing about your battles.